The meeting is being recorded, as I think we know, although it seems that the recording of the March 3rd meeting is deleted or lost or not available. So Cynthia did provide minutes for February 3rd and February 17th, which I sent around. I hope you've had a chance to look at them. So we'll entertain adjustments or edits to the February 3rd minutes.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Is there a second?
I really shouldn't second the approval of my minutes. Anybody else?
Looks like maybe we're reviewing them once again.
Yeah.
Right. I reviewed them before. The only thing that I'm wondering is there's a few places in both of these sets of minutes where it says there was a discussion of whatever, and it doesn't say what we decided. And so I know probably no formal vote was taken. And I also don't know, sometimes we discuss something multiple times and I don't know which date we finally decided. So like, for example, in this one, it says there was a discussion of a very large definition of a very large project. I know that we've agreed to that definition several times, and maybe we just, we didn't in this meeting. So I'm just wondering if
So to be honest, Terry, having listened to like 2 or 3 meetings in a row, we have the same discussion multiple
right.
times. So, and we don't decide to change anything. So I don't really know how to, besides sort of doing a word for word, and
No, we don't want that. I guess,
but if there is an area where you think that I missed something that was an important,
well, I know we've decided about the definition of the large project. I think
yes.
2 items that are in these minutes that I'm not sure about are the template and the possibility of the standing capital committee. And so the standing capital committee we've discussed a lot of times, but we haven't really, I guess we haven't totally decided that. I'm not sure. But the template was really confusing to me because I thought we had decided that. This just says we presented it. I know we presented it twice.
Yes, that is correct.
Is this the first time? And the board said go back and make these changes? And then the second time we approved it, or that's what I just don't remember.
So Terry, I don't think we've taken a vote
No,
to
right.
approve the template or any of the other aspects that are noted in the minutes as being discussed. So I concur with your concern that there's not much detail associated with the statements about discussion, but
and I'm happy to go back and fill those in with more detail. I don't mind doing that.
Well, maybe the simplest thing is, since it's on our agenda today, maybe we just take all the votes today. And then it just should be on the record at some minutes that at some point we voted all these things. I know we voted the large project definition, and I think that was way back
or something
before COVID.
Yeah.
so we have intentionally not voted on any of these elements as we have been refining the draft recommendations.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in our meeting today, we'll discuss it yet again, and we now put it down on paper. And so at the end of our discussion, we'll decide if we're ready to vote to approve these recommendations or whether they warrant additional discussion. But I think if the task force would like to see more detail in the minutes of February 3rd and February 17th, we can not approve them today and go back and try to add details, either from the recordings or from our collective notes.
Yeah, I can do from the recordings. That's not a problem.
So sentiment of the task force, shall we add details to these minutes and return in 2 weeks with a new iteration?
The details, any decisions that we might have made or
Make any decisions.
Hmm? We didn't make any decisions, right?
But I'm happy to fill in more detail if that would make people more comfortable. That's fine.
Whatever.
I don't see that as a need. I felt like the minutes did fairly articulate generally what the discussion was about, which is what the minutes is I think the minutes are supposed to do, but I'm
Yeah.
happy to defer and withdraw my motion. Because I don't think it was seconded.
We don't have a second yet.
I'll second it.
Okay,
So you can withdraw it now.
so there's a motion that has been seconded to approve the February 3rd minutes as written. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Stephen Crane, aye, yeah.
All opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, they're approved. Now let's look at the February 17th minutes. And is there a motion to approve those as written?
Motion to approve is written.
And is there a second?
Second,
All those in favor of approving the February 17th minutes as written? Aye.
aye, Stephen Crane, aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions? Lori, I don't know if you voted on this or not.
I didn't, and you were already,
We're in the middle of it, so.
you're in the middle of it, yeah.
Would you like to abstain or would you like to?
I will abstain.
All right.
since I'm so.
So the vote is 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 in favor, 1 abstention for the February 17th minutes. So the March 3rd minutes are not available for review. And because we do not have a recording for that, Cynthia, I'll be happy to help you merge my notes with yours for March 3rd. And if anyone else has notes from that meeting 2 weeks ago that they'd like to put in the mix, that would be helpful. And let's agree that we will put a little more substance in the minutes about what it is we talked about, whether or not we make a vote or not. Is that
I
agreeable?
thought we had a very good discussion, and then I went to look on the YouTube and there was no YouTube, and yeah.
Right. Yes, we're all disappointed because that was a very good discussion 2 weeks ago, and it would have been helpful to have the recording, but
Alas.
this is where we are.
Yes.
So, I think collectively we can put together a good record of the March 3rd conversation. So our next meeting will be March 31st, 2 weeks at 3 o'clock. Also by Zoom, probably the same link. Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia, for working on those minutes. All right, so our discussion today, we're going to be we want to talk about a number of things. Let's start first with the draft table of contents for the recommendations. So I'm interested to know, I circulated the draft, the table of contents with some suggestions that Terry made in yellow. I'd like to sort of move through this and agree whether we want to include these elements in this report or whether we think we could streamline the report in any way. So the first section would be the executive summary that would have the goals and recommendations. And obviously we can't write that until we vote on what our recommendations are.
Lisa, I want to make sure I'm looking at the right version. The version you sent around just, I think, today, is that the one that's redlined?
Actually, no, the one that's redlined is that is the draft recommendations. But what I'm looking at is the table of contents.
Yeah,
So it's
At March 3rd.
It's probably March 3rd or not even sure if it has a date on it. It says, starts off draft of report to select board, table of contents.
Oh, I've got TOC for report.
That's
Date
it.
March 17.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Letter of transmittal.
Letter of transmittal, executive summary, including goals and recommendations. The body of the report would start with the Roman numeral 2, the capital planning task force, the task force charge,
Mhm.
the approach of our work, the process that we followed, and what we heard from the public.
So can I ask you a clarifying question, Elise? So what I didn't see here, and I don't know whether it's in this section or the thought is to put it elsewhere, but the different options that we looked at in terms of standing committee, different processes, et cetera, is your thought that that goes under approach and process, or is it, or should it be explicit? My thought is it would be kind of explicit somewhere. These are the options that we, here are the issues that we looked at. Here are some different options for each issue.
Right.
Up to the
To be
record.
there, yeah.
Well, there's a set of draft recommendations that were a part of that as well. And if you, and that, the draft recommendation, the recommendations are gonna be where that's nested and it summarizes, I think, some of the stuff we've talked about so far. Like I said, we haven't voted on anything, but I think it captured, some of the conversation.
Is that on recommended capital planning process, Steve? Roman numeral 5?
Are you looking at table of contents?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I was, because they were saying, where is that? I was looking at, I jumped over to the draft recommendations that were also
Okay.
part of the.
Well, maybe I am taking this out of order. I've got it on the agenda in this order, but perhaps it would be clearer, more helpful if we looked at the draft recommendations first
Okay.
and then move to the report outline and that. So if that is agreeable,
Idea.
okay. So there are two documents. One is dated March 17th and one is was sent just today that includes suggestions, comments from Carl. So let's look at the ones that you received today, which are redlined. It's the Capital Planning Task Force draft recommendations. And I think the file has Carl's edits or something, some note to
Yeah.
that effect. Yeah. Right. All right. So I tried to put things into, tried to put things in writing so that we could actually have a benchmark for recording our conversations. So items A through F are the actions that the charge requires. So in my simplistic view, I thought we should have a recommendation to paired with each of those required actions. So A is the definition of a very large project, and this is the definition that we voted on several months ago, and that we presented at the public forum, and that we're sticking with, as far as I know. The second item B. Well, is any discussion about that? Okay, item B, develop a template format for the town and schools to complete annually. We have a template draft that Terry and Carrie have been working on and that we have seen a couple of times. And I think the last time we reviewed it, we had a suggestion for an added information, which may or may not have been possible to incorporate. And linked with this is the annual review of the needs assessment. And the 3 bullet points are the discussions that we, summarize the discussions that we have had about the needs assessment.
Elise, I kind of see this as 2 separate recommendations. The template format is one, and the needs assessment, I mean, they're obviously related, but I don't know, maybe we should separate it into 2 things. And I could go either way, but that's what I'm thinking right now. But the other thing is, it says B, develop a template format. And then in capitals later, it says template draft, see appendix. I think that language should match. So where it says template draft, maybe it should say sample template format.
Okay, template format. So I do, Terry, I do agree that there are 2 pieces to this. One is the financial template modeling that that you and Carrie worked on, that showed a range of projects and possible timelines, and which I in my shorthand call the flatten the debt curve template.
Yeah.
So the action required by the charge, though, asks for other elements besides financial. And so that's why I have that linked with the needs assessment, the demonstrated need, the estimated construction costs, the climate impacts, vulnerabilities. There are other elements that would go into the decision-making about or prioritizing of projects. And so the question is, shall we work on a template that captures all of those elements? Or is a criteria list that would parallel that would be incorporated in the criteria list under item D? Will that meet those needs?
Well, at least this is Prasha. I
And
kind of
D-
feel like the 2 ought to be separated as well. And the way I kind of viewed the charge was item B was the template, or I'll say, application that includes information for a particular project, that includes the things that are listed there. Where's the location, the need, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the need could include criteria that are discussed a little bit later. And then the review of all of the projects, if you will, as part of that needs assessment. And in my mind, that's a bit part of item number C, which is the process and evaluating all of these. So B is almost, in my mind, a list of B. The list of items in B are inputs into the process described in C. And then that process includes all the criteria and everything else we talked about. That's the way I kind of would have thought about this, because so in any case, actually,
Right.
criteria goes into D, actually, to be honest.
So,
Yeah, I
I'm saying,
agree.
what are you saying goes into D?
So, so the criteria we developed around,
Yeah.
around climate change and environmental efficiency, all those criteria where we talk about the need for all that, that in my mind goes into item D, all the proposed criteria, which is exactly where you have it.
So I have all of that criteria in D.
Exactly.
All right, so,
I
All right.
think what would help, Elise, is if we reordered it. So like first we defined what large project is. Then we went to C and we determined the process, and then D, criteria, and then comes a template. Does that make sense?
yep, that's fine.
Well,
So-
you're doing this in order of the charge.
Directly quoted, pulled right out of the
Mm.
charge.
Okay. So
Right, but
that doesn't
now,
have to,
but in chronological order of how it'll actually be done,
mhm,
the template will come near the end.
mhm.
The financial template, yeah.
Yeah.
Although we did that pretty early. Early on, but anyway.
Well, yeah, it's, we have worked all of these elements simultaneously all along. And so I think that that's,
Yeah. Fine.
we're seeing that now. So, all right. So we've got the A, we concur on A. We concur on D, that the criteria belong in that.
Yeah, and to your point, Elise, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think about this, I mean, the template, as we've referred to it, is a debt service schedule. That's what that document is. And those are needed when you're planning tier 3 projects. You need a debt service schedule that shows existing debt and projected debt. And so those should be a part of documentation for tier 3. I think where I'm stuck is the tier 3 projects are generally going to commence with some kind of feasibility study, because they're usually of a scale where you need to do some kind of preliminary analysis before you really start putting together a proposal for funding. You're really hiring an architect, engineer, consultant to say, what are we really doing here? Because it's a huge project. And so that's where the template thing, I think, is tough, because having an architect or engineer or some other kind of consultant adhere to a template that is more appropriate for a much smaller type of capital project may not be a good fit. And so that's why I think if we make the comment that, you know, whatever the analysis, the initial analysis of tier 3 projects should be in a format that's, you know, easy to digest and includes and addresses all of these criteria. And so the template really is not the form of the document we get back. It's a template for, for how the content is presented. It should be easy to read, and it should address the criteria, and that's the template. But not like it needs to have like, you know, owner, address, you know, like not a form necessarily, but make sure that it has certain minimum criteria.
Steve, I see where you're going, and maybe should we add something that says fit for the appropriate phase in which the project is? So you might have some more general stuff much earlier,
Yep.
but if the project continues to progress, you'd get more and more detail.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, whether we end up with a separate committee or an enhanced process, when the tier 3 project is presented, the report that is submitted as a part of that presentation, should or must address all these criteria and be in a format that is accessible to the general public.
Criteria in D, D.
Yeah. So the criteria in D, and perhaps there are additional criteria that should be added to that
Well,
list.
and include a debt service schedule that
Right.
Okay.
and Kerry worked on, and include a debt service schedule.
So essentially, it's most of the content that's shown in B moved down. Early on, you're not going to have all that content. Yeah.
Right.
So I guess I'm a little confused now. I see what's happening now. There's 2 types of templates. One is the debt service schedule that is really needed for citizens and could be posted on the website and everything. But earlier than that, I guess the enhanced process or the committee is going to have to look at all the requests, I guess. And that is not a financial, that's got some finances in it, but it's also got some needs assessment stuff in. And this happens, I'm thinking, before the feasibility study,
Exactly right.
really early in the process.
Early.
Be years before.
Right.
And that's why I was suggesting, Terry, that information may be a lot more general. It
Right.
may not have some of the detail, but it should at least discuss to the extent that's feasible in that particular phase that it is, the criteria, address the criteria that we have. Some of it may be known at this point and would have to be filled in 2 years later if the project even progresses.
Right. So it's almost like we need two sorts of templates. The financial debt service one that we've been looking at, that's later on. And then we need an earlier one that shows all the requests.
Well, I think what Stephen was saying is rather than having a template, have the criteria listed that must be addressed
Yeah.
by each project. And that way they can be summarized and put into a report in a way that's fit for purpose relative to each project and where it is in a 10-year
I
cycle.
thought Stephen was really saying
Okay.
combining the two together in a report, which will become more and more detailed as the project moves along. That's
Yeah, I
what-
guess the way I look at it is,
So you'd have the debt.
yeah, I mean, a needs, and actually I was voluntold by the chair to come up with a recommendation about an impact calculator at the end of the last meeting. And I didn't actually write the recommendation, but I do have, I'll share my screen in a minute with some of the ones that our designer for the middle school supplied to us. And because I think there's a debt service schedule that is beneficial, I think, for decision makers. And then there's the calculator that everybody else wants to see. And so I want to separate those two things even further. But from a practical standpoint, a needs assessment doesn't get you to a tier 3 capital request. A needs assessment is, you know, I'm going to use the public safety complex on Walden Street, just as an example. We have it, the TVA needs assessment says these systems are outdated, this space is outdated, you need to do X, Y, and Z. That stands alone. That is not a capital request. If we go to the next level and say, okay, you know, architect or engineer, come in and do a feasibility study of what it would take to replace this either on site or at a different location, and maybe even identify a few locations that would be suitable. That study is what gets you to, and not always, it's not 100% hard and fast rule on all of this, but generally, that's how these projects move forward. And as I've said 1,000 times, what usually happens after that is a committee of volunteers gets formed around that tier 3 project, based on that feasibility study and then site selection and everything else, which is why I was the standalone committee for our purposes, I thought would be better served for project-based, but it doesn't really matter either way. It can be the same committee going forward. It can be a ad hoc for one project, or it can be standing, you know, generally. But that's how these, I mean, in real time in the world of municipal capital improvement, my experience, and I'm only speaking from my own experience alone, is that's how these really get to decision makers, is at the feasibility study phase. And the feasibility studies, you guys have seen a million of them, I'm sure, in your time as volunteers or in your work lives. They can look very different, but as long as they're checking all of the boxes we expect them to check, that's really what's important.
So I'll just have a counter argument. Our charge very specifically asks us to do something where we do provide a mechanism and a structure to sequence large capital projects. So I thought the charge was pretty clear about that. And I think what people were looking for, let's just go back in the Wayback Machine. If we were going back to 2010, when the high school project was emerging, it was a very large project, no doubt about that. They were looking at that point for somebody to say, okay, we're doing the high school project now as a total redo. Ms. Woodward is completely familiar with the whole genesis of the high school project. I think what people were looking for at that point, the town of Concord would say, okay, this is the expected debt on this. And the next very large project is going to be the Concord Middle School. And the next very large project is going to be blah. So in 2010, we would have that 10-year outlook. Now we're 20. And they would probably have sequenced it about now, maybe a little earlier, depending on the economy, et cetera. You know, and then what were the next ones? What would the outlook have been in 2010, 2011, 15, and so on? I think that's what people are looking for. And maybe you could say, you know, it's pretty hard to look beyond the middle school project. You just say, we have these two big things. And then maybe in 2016 or 17, we can think about taking a look at what's down the road. And it's going to change.
Well, so I think that this is the conundrum. So the timeline of any one of these very large projects is multiple years. Let's say it's 5 to 7 years. Okay,
Mhm.
that'll be my stalking horse timeline.
Mhm.
And that's from the time that you say, we need a new high school. We're going to hire the design team to do the needs assessment. They're going to evaluate renovating the existing building versus building new.
Mhm.
And they'll do all of that needs assessment, and that'll take a year and a half, something like that.
Mhm.
And then we'll make a decision.
Mhm.
And you'll also have a cost associated with it coming out of that needs assessment.
Mhm.
And that cost associated with it is what would drive the design, which would take 24 months, maybe
Yeah.
18 to 24 months,
Yep.
and then go into construction.
Yep.
So it's fine to be able to list the potential projects. We could probably do that, in the next 10 minutes. Collectively, we could figure out which projects should be on that list.
Right.
But we wouldn't be able to sequence them until the actual needs assessments were done with firm cost estimates, I suspect.
You get I'm sorry, but I think the needs assessment is getting confused with the feasibility study. And
Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
there was a needs assessment. There's usually a number, associated with that, but it's a very vague number. You don't really start getting hard numbers or until you get the feasibility study. That's the process.
You're correct. I should have called that the feasibility study, not the needs assessment. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, there are certainly needs assessments that include elements of a feasibility study. Sometimes
Yeah.
sometimes they are consolidated, but generally the needs assessment is what's the shape of your current building.
Right.
Or in the feasibility. And sometimes it can say, but here's what you really need at a conceptual level. The feasibility is what would that look like from a bricks and mortar standpoint. And I think, and Cynthia, I don't think you were making a contrary argument at all. I think it's in item C, part of the charge is clear about sequencing and timing. And I do think, notwithstanding evaluation of the physical condition of a particular facility, the debt schedule is the single biggest tool that we use in sequencing. And that
Can I ask
sequencing,
a
sorry, go ahead, Prashant.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, and that sequencing is not looking at the projects that are, in the queue today. That sequencing, that scheduling is looking at, all right, what did we borrow 15 years ago that we're gonna
Mhm.
pay off in the next 5? And how do we, so that's really, the long range debt schedule is really the number one sequencing tool.
Right.
So can I
That's
just get a
why
clarification, maybe?
Yeah.
But Parashar is
Elise,
going to talk now.
Elise, you made a good point, I think, or a question, and building a little bit on what Stephen said. Do we agree that right now, if we got together and made a list of 10 potential projects people have been thinking about, somebody said that's easy. Do we agree that hypothetically that would be the core of the first report that looks out 10 years? I understand some of them may not have needs assessments done or feasibility studies done, or are we suggesting a particular idea makes it to the list only when a needs assessment is done? I think for me, it would be very helpful to get that clarified, because that
I think
in
it's
essence,
more that first thing that you described there, that it's yeah. I mean, you're not even, the projects would be early on the list even before the needs assessment.
okay, I just want to make sure.
On the list for a couple of years. Now it's time to do a needs assessment, and go along, you get finer and finer and define
And
what
that-
the project
right,
is
and that-
until finally
and
somebody
that's
can
what I-
build it.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. And so in my mind, if we have a list of 10 or 12 ideas today, maybe a couple of them have sufficient information to, really substantively address the criteria we're talking about, but others may not. But as they continue down the pipeline and you get to needs and feasibility assessment, you can address those criteria more substantively. And at some point, as Stephen said, you're in the process of actually refining the potential impact of the debt schedule. So I just want to make sure that we're looking at a broader funnel and then narrowing it down versus having a requirement that it needs assessment first.
Right.
But just,
I agree with Parashar and Cynthia. I think this is what people want. They don't really care if the fire station is, in FY 30 or FY 26. We don't have to know all that right now, but they want to see that the public safety building is on that list because they want to know what's coming down the pipe. Well, we're probably going to have a public safety building and a public works building and whatever, they want to see the list. And obviously the details will change. That's why it has to be updated every year.
but as far as the debt schedule, I mean, as Stephen says, that debt schedule goes out, 30 years. And so I think in judging, as you're going along, where these projects are and where they're going to fall, keeping an idea of, the debt schedule and, in whatever, 5 years, this project's going to get pretty, paid off and we'll have some money to spend.
Can I just, I want to comment on what Parashar and Terry and Carl were just saying, because I think that there's instead of this committee, I don't think the charge of this committee is not to name a list of projects. I just want to make sure that you're being metaphorical there. Right. So we're not naming projects, we're naming a process for the projects. And to go back to your point, the entire reason that I perceive that we are here is because projects only got talked about when they emerged out of a process in isolation.
Correct.
Yep.
So that's why I think the process is important. And I agree with you that what's the list? It really is only a sequence of single projects not connected to each other, I think is the issue we're trying to resolve, which again, I think the debt schedule is really the big thing. And then the next phase of it is once we get into a more serious, once you start to drill down into the funnel of detail, as somebody called it, that's when the calculator, I think, comes in as an effective tool. But that's really, you have to have something beyond the back of the envelope to really have to be meaningful. But can I share my screen for a minute, at least to just show the calculator? Because
Okay, that'd be good.
Because everyone here knows what a debt schedule is. We've looked at Terry's sample and kind of done that. But I also think that it's important to have, just for illustrative purposes, I have a handful of them, but I'll just show one for now. Does everybody see my cursor moving?
Yep.
Yes.
So this is for the Sharon High School. I plugged in $500,000. So calculate. So if I have $500,000 assessed value house, I know what my tax bills are going to look like for the next 20 years. This is the impact. It's 73 cents on the rate in the first year. It's $30 a month, quarterly, and then annual. And so this is a very helpful tool to show what's it mean for me. And so you can show the debt service schedule to the average resident, but that doesn't tell them what it means for them in their tax bill. So I do think that this has to be a part of that template as well at some point in time in the consideration process. Because in hearing what a lot of the comments we've been receiving in our own discussions, this I think is really as important to the voter, to the average voter, as the debt service schedule is too. I think they're both equally important.
Right. So this tool could be in the appendix. I think we should add this to the appendix.
The calculator tool.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I think what Stephen's suggesting is, again, when appropriate in the phase of the project, that a calculator specific to that project be made available to residents, right, Stephen? We ought to make sure that's built into our recommendations.
It was my job to write that, and I didn't, because I wasn't, to be honest with you, I wasn't 100% certain where I would plug that in. And because even the plugin for template, I think, is moved around a little bit even in this discussion, but I do think it's easy. We'll just attach it to the template discussion.
The list of things that have to be addressed at some point.
Yes.
Okay,
The template does have a column, Stephen, as you recommended and this group wanted. We did add a column for the median assessed house, what the tax bill would be. But I like the idea of a more personalized calculator as well, where each citizen can go in and figure out for their own house.
right. It amplifies that, the debt service schedule template.
And actually, Stephen, if you want to go one step further, you could just have the resident, type in the address, pull it from the town records and it helps the calculator. I'm serious.
That is way above my pay grade.
It probably exists, Parashar, you know.
I'm sure it does. Maybe we can
Yeah.
get a volunteer to do that
Yeah,
for us.
yeah. So Cynthia, has this addressed your thought about the sequencing of projects? That the town's municipal building assessment, which is essentially a physical assessment of the town-owned properties, tells us one set of information, you know, whether the buildings and their systems are, what shape they're in. Then we have the criteria list, which is evaluates the characteristics of the projects from climate perspective, whether it would be a long-term solution to a perceived need, et cetera. And all of that would happen to identify projects that would be on a general project list well in advance of actual feasibility studies being authorized for any one of those projects.
I just think we need to somehow or another pull all this information together in a nice graphical format. And I'm not sure where in our recommendations that sits in terms of, you know, the current, like we can pretty much predict once we have a town meeting for the middle school, what the debt will look like for that project.
Well, the middle school
Mhm.
is on the other side of the feasibility study.
Yeah.
The middle school is, you know, closing in on the feasibility assessment, right?
Right. Mhm.
Finishing.
And with that will be a precise cost estimate. Well, they're not,
Right.
right?
We just don't know how much it's going to cost to bond the project exactly, but we know how much it's going to cost to build the project. Yeah.
Well, so you'll have a construction cost, and then the project costs will be, you know, computed in some way, either, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
And so, and that will give Concord the bottom line number that we will probably vote to agree to live with.
Right. Exactly.
And so modifications to that, changes during the construction process, bonding costs, whatever,
Right.
will be adjusted in
Yep.
order to hold that bottom line number.
Yeah.
That's pretty much what happened with the high school, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So I think that's that number will go into that debt service template and be carried forward and renewed every year, that sort of thing.
Right. And I just think what people are looking for is that's going to be a pretty steep arc with a little
Right.
bit of the down arc of the high school, but it's going to be, you know.
Yeah.
So I just think people want to know what is the, obviously the town has the capacity. This isn't an override or anything like that to issue more debt. But the point is, you know, when are we going to see that trending down and then maybe allowing for another very large project? Or we can make the decision as a community, you know what? We're not going to wait for that. We need to do this very large project now. but we're just trying to figure out how this all.
But you want to know what the impact is.
Right.
The tax impact before you
Yeah.
make those decisions. By the way, there's a project I understand going on now where the cost is actually changing while the project's going on because it's working on a 150-year-old building. So you don't always know the cost precisely.
Well, you don't know the cost precisely, but you have a budget cost that you're trying to live with.
Yeah.
And so you've got a couple of choices. If the costs change, either you adjust the expectations for the project to keep the number where it's been agreed to be, or there's additional expenditures in order to accommodate those modifications.
You know, or you
That's all.
include something in the overall project cost. This is post feasibility study. When you're doing the overall project cost, you include a contingency
Exactly, right.
that's suitable for the kind of project it is.
At least, were you looking for a vote on each of these pieces? Do you want to vote a package? What are you looking for?
Well, I'm looking for consensus primarily.
Yeah,
And when I think we've got consensus, or if we don't have consensus, then I think we should take a vote. So
Or take a vote to assess consensus.
we may want to do that. We may want to take a vote or straw poll to assess consensus. Parashar.
So at least I'm gonna probably regret what I'm about to say, but I'll say it anyway. I'll volunteer, if folks are amenable, to develop a pure hypothetical, no real names attached, list of maybe 4 or 5 projects in different phases, and a little bit of sense of, hey, at this phase, what can we expect, et cetera, to maybe help us visualize, and if folks think it would be helpful to put in the report, to bring to life what we're talking about. Because as we just had this discussion, I can imagine somebody reading the report and not having a clear sense, well, what projects would be included, not included, what do you get? So if folks are willing, I'm willing to take a stab at what that would look like. I'm not talking 30 pages, but as Cynthia said, some graphical summary, if you will, clearly outlining for each project, what would be discussed in what detail, depending on where.
So you're like a sample capital plan, is basically kind of what you're talking
At
about.
a very high level. Again, I'm not talking 80 pages, but again, just to give a bit of flavor of what people might expect in a.
You should put a few ringers in there so they don't take it too seriously.
So I guess,
None of it will be real.
well,
Right.
I think, I appreciate the idea, and what I heard is somewhere between 30 and 80 pages, because you said not 30 and not 80, so that's obviously somewhere, it's a 50-page report. I mean, we have debt service schedules. I mean, Carrie LaFleur has drafted debt service schedules for some of the actual projects. I don't know how important the narrative is on how far out most of those are, but since she's not here, I don't want to volunteer her for, but maybe the conversation is what is a debt service schedule based on what we do know today look like, and let's talk that through.
Well,
I
the
think
template that Terry and Carrie developed already has a series of projects, 5 maybe, 4 or 5. And a graphic, Parashar, could be developed for that, to match that template, to try to illustrate that. And I think it would be like 1 diagram or 3 diagrams, something like that, something minor.
yeah.
Well, you had a table in that
Yeah.
template that.
Right,
did-
and I think Terry already has some methodologies. You could probably put it together very quickly, so.
Yeah. So I think that would be a prefer. I appreciate your offer, Parashar, but I think we should try to merge it with Carrie's current methodology. I think that would be, and merge with the template that we already, the stalking horse template that we already have seen. I think that would
So
be
to
ideal.
get back to Cynthia's point, I would like to go through your list of recommendations, Elise, and see where we do have consensus, because I think we should take a vote on all of them. and solidify, yes, we agree. Everyone agrees, this is the project definition. Let's get that in the minutes. Let's see which ones we can kind of cross off our list and make progress with. Because I think we have probably at least 3 of them that we're all agreeing to.
I
Okay,
think
well-
the template and the criteria are pretty
Right,
solid.
Well, I guess how I was about to say that is there consensus that when the charge refers to template, our recommendation is a template, meaning a set of requirements that tier 3 project requests should have, as opposed to the creation of a specific form? Did that come out right?
Yeah, I think,
Oh, but I
isn't that
think-
what we discussed earlier?
Yeah, I'm just saying, we never really said, is there consensus on that point? We've been talking about it, and it certainly sounds like there is, but we're not creating a specific form. So when the charge says template, we're not creating a form. We're just saying whatever comes in has to meet these criteria and have these components.
At an appropriate level based on where it is in the development phase.
Sure.
Carl,
Whatever, but I think, as whatever this form should have, and when, that describe, I mean, the template that Terry and Kerry put together, I think had a lot of that in there. And so, okay, you don't have to put that, here it is exactly, but at least use that as a model when you're describing what this template should be. I would suggest.
so
Can I?
I
share
think
my screen?
I think our semantics are challenging in some respects here. So the financial form that Terry and Carrie put together, we are calling a template format for debt service schedule. This one. I think the question on the table is, do we agree that that is in fact the template that we would propose or recommend that be used for tier 3 projects? And in addition to that, in parallel with that, will be a list of criteria, not a form, but a list of criteria to be checked
Mhm.
with each project. So every one of the projects on this template would have a list of criteria that would define it, not a form.
That's what I thought.
Sounds good.
Okay, any objections to that?
And what are we going to call it?
We're going to call it a criteria evaluation or yeah, something like that.
All right, whatever.
I think we can call it a template because that's what the chart says. As long as, we just-
Okay.
like I said, I'm just trying to distinguish a template meaning a form from a template meaning a set of criteria.
right.
In our-
So semantics, to settle that, the template is going to be both those things together.
Right,
A
And
two-part.
we will have fulfilled our charge.
right. I shared my screen. Does everybody see
Yeah,
this? Okay, so it says criteria checked, question mark. So like for the middle school,
oh, okay. This is-
project A in process, project B, yes, project C, no, they haven't done it yet. And that 55 million hasn't been scheduled yet. It's way out in years. So I think there are 2 different things. This is the proposed template. It doesn't have to be exactly like this, it's a proposed sample template. And then criteria checked has to do with D in Elise's.
Right.
It lists all the criteria.
Mm.
Yes.
Well, Carrie, do you anticipate being able to click on this criteria and have it pull down the criteria so you can see how the project performed relative to each of those criteria?
No,
Or do you see that as a separate?
Sure, if that's what people want.
No, I'm just trying to say, I mean,
So at least this is where I was going, is I think we've got a lot of criteria, and it may be a bit complex to put it into one Excel spreadsheet. But
Right.
what I thought might be helpful to address, Cynthia's point about trying to visualize this for folks is a very high level summary that would include, a sample here would be these 5 projects, a little bit of overall costs, check whether it needs assessments been done, feasibility, give you a sense of where it is in the stage. And then perhaps just a series of columns for the major criteria. And you could either check it off or not applicable because you're way too early in the stage, something like that, to give it a bit of life as to how folks might expect to see it as a front end of an annual report.
So what you're saying is on this column D criteria would be maybe instead 4 or 5 columns long. And one is sustainability and one is, maintenance.
Well, how many, we had a bunch of criteria. We had more than 5
yeah,
criteria.
And
I
again,
view
I
it
don't
the
know that-
opposite. I view the intake, the request is a narrative, and this debt service schedule is one part of that narrative. It's it's not I don't want to say it's an attachment because it's an integral part, but this spreadsheet is a part of a study, a feasibility study or something like that, whatever the request, document is. And then there would be a narrative about the criteria items.
Right. I
The
was,
whole thing, I don't know, it kind of prospectus, I guess, is what we're,
but then Stephen, you'd have to summarize all that in an executive summary, right? And that's where I was going is
Yeah,
I was gonna just develop a summary of everything you just said, not the detail for each project.
yeah. No, it'll be an executive summary, but I mean, you should be able to read through each particular item and that including what is the debt impacts over the long term, and then have a calculator that's usable.
Yes.
And that's why I was trying to separate the debt schedule from the project narrative. I'm not trying to separate them; they're integrated. The debt schedule is a part of the project narrative, but it's not the only. It doesn't supplant. The other criteria, which are
It's a required element. It's a required element.
right.
I think we're almost getting to consensus and then we somehow another slip away. So
I think we've gotten there on
Yeah,
this
I
one.
think
right?
I am supporting the template as the template and the criteria as the criteria.
And both are required for each project that's on the list. And some of the projects, the criteria responses may be general because it's way too early.
Right.
But as the project gets updated each year and as the list gets updated each year, you'd add more and change as necessary to both the criteria for the project and the template for the project.
So I'd
The whole
I'd
thing.
like to make a motion then that we vote to accept on Elise's recommendations here. A, the definition of large project, B, the template, and D, the criteria. They might not be in this order at the end in the final report, but that we vote that we approve of these recommendations.
Second,
Can I just amend that we vote to approve going ahead? Just to, kind of hedge our bets a little bit.
What do you mean
So-
going ahead?
So,
That we approve going ahead with these things that of accept. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to throw. a little-
okay,
no.
so Terry, you have a motion and Carl has recommended that it be adjusted to approve moving forward with items A, B, and D.
Yeah.
Do you include that with your motion?
Yes.
And Cynthia, do you include that with the second?
I do.
All right, so we have a motion that's seconded. All in favor?
Do you want to do roll call?
Oh, yeah, we could do, yeah, let's do a roll call. Why not, yeah.
Sorry.
Terry
Just like the
Ackerman,
Republicans slowing things down.
Terry Ackerman,
Aye.
Stephen Crane,
Aye.
Laurie Hunter,
Yes.
Cynthia Rainey,
Yes.
Carl Packard,
Yes.
Jared Stanton,
Yes.
Elise Woodward, yes. 7 votes. Parashar is
I
a
don't vote,
non-voting
so-
member.
Yep.
Yes, okay. All right. Thank you.
That's good stuff.
Good stuff. All right. Shall we talk about, let's see, what are we? It's 4 o'clock. Shall we talk about item C, which is the recommendations that I first sent to you includes the elements that we have discussed previously and looked at in our PowerPoint, et cetera. And Carl has presented some refinements. So Carl, do you want to address your comments?
Sure. Does everybody have a copy of this, or should I put it up on the screen here?
I
Either-
sent it
I
out.
think we got members of the public, Elise. Do we want to share the screen so that they can see?
Okay.
That would be
alright.
good. Thank you. Carl, are you able to
Okay.
do that?
Yeah, let's see, I have to find it. Okay, first I have to share
You want?
and then find it on there. And there it is. Okay. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
Red marks and all that? Okay. Darn it, come on. There we go.
So this is the charge asks this committee to determine the process for evaluation, timing, and prioritization of projects, balancing the priorities of different stakeholders and balancing service demand with affordability.
So in terms of process, that this is what this was addressing.
Right.
And I think the successful or the capital planning that has been done when we've done long-range capital planning has been done by a dedicated committee. And I think that part of the reason that things kind of went astray was that there was not a standing committee. And so I'm recommending that there be a standing committee and that there are, some certain responsibilities that the committee would have. And I also think that the committee should be proactive in trying to look at what the town's needs for capital and assets are going to be in the future. And we can I'll get in a little bit to my recommendations on what that future should be, but but anyway, so basically, looking into what things would be needed and anticipating, and then reviewing the proposals and finally making recommendations. And doing this, and then there's a few other sort of backup things that this capital planning committee would provide continuity through the citizen involvement in the development and implementation of the plan, and would be focusing on capital planning as opposed to other matters, and maybe in that way it could be more useful to the town manager and the select board. And just again, they would be appointed by the select board and basically would be meeting annually around the time when this town and school administration put together their proposals. And some years it would be one meeting, other years when there's a lot going on, it might be a little bit more, but it would basically just be meeting annually. And it would be involved with the town and school administrations in their review of the plan. I think that it really should be a 20-year plan, but that's just, because 20 years goes by really quickly. I found, and when they did the long-range plan back in 2003, 2005, they were recommending and looking at a 20-year plan. So I know you don't always know what's going to happen in 20 years, but eventually that 20 years becomes now, and it's good to kind of look at these things ahead of time. And that part of this being proactive would be that the committee would review long-term trends and challenges that will affect the town's capital assets over that horizon of the plan. Such things, resilience against, in light of global warming. There may be, large costs involved with having to retrofit ventilation systems. And I know, like in some places out in Colorado, where they have the municipalities have large numbers of buildings, they're talking about billions of dollars that are going to have to be spent on upgrading mechanical systems. Just so it could be a big number. And then, of course, in this process, always be monitoring basically the financial capacity and the effective debt service that shows up on that template form. And that was basically it.
So thank you. So this committee has talked at some length about the pros and cons of a standing capital planning committee. And I would say that we perhaps don't have consensus about this, but have been pursuing what we called an enhanced process to enhance or modify the current town and school capital planning processes. So Carl's suggestions here are, in fact, to insert a standing capital planning committee into this process. And
Definitely be an enhancement.
it would be an enhancement, right? And so we've also talked about authority and responsibility, and the authority of accorded through the charter. And so Cynthia has sent some thoughts about authority. And so Cynthia, do you want to mention that at this point before we discuss this standing committee?
Yes, certainly.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of items. There's state law, and I just want to pick out the region is its own entity and really legally can't be bound by any of this process. I'm not saying that the superintendent and the regional school committee wouldn't participate, and I don't anticipate that there's any large capital project at the region in the long-term future. The other thing is the town charter cedes all responsibility essentially for capital projects to the town manager, but it does make a statement in item E. It says, unless a special committee of the town is created for such purpose, which that's a very broad statement, and I'm not paid money to know how to interpret that. And then the maintenance of the schools, as even mentioned in the town charter, is really left in the hands of the superintendent and the school committee. So,
of course, a standing planning committee has no authority whatsoever, and in most towns, it really is making recommendations, just like the finance committee.
right. I'm just saying that's what the chart,
Mhm.
There's that statement in the charter. I don't exactly know what it means, to be honest.
That seems to give more authority, I think is necessary to capital planning committee. That statement they were talking about.
Yeah, so That, I know what they envisioned, but with that statement, but it's what it is.
Elise, can I ask Carl a question?
Yes, of course.
Cynthia, did you have other thoughts?
Nope.
I had a similar question. So if you scroll down, Carl, I'm kind of curious, the notion of looking at debt and the town's finances, that I kind of viewed that as what the finance committee does. And I'm kind of curious how you see the interaction between the two.
Well, to the same extent that we're talking about here of the debt service schedule as being part of the analytical document that is created as part of the capital planning process, the enhanced capital planning process. The financial capacity and the debt service schedule are highly interrelated.
Yeah, I guess just looking at this, I've always thought that adding another standing committee sort of makes the process more complex. And if the concern or the perspective is that we need a closer look at the impact of the debt service, et cetera, that's something the finance committee could be asked to do. And I'm pretty sure folks would be pretty happy to do that. I mean, we do that to a certain extent, as you know, anyway. So I'm kind of curious just how the two would interact.
Well, a couple of things. Having citizen involvement in anything makes it more complex. But in the finance committee, in some towns, the finance committee actually does do capital planning, but that particular subject is omitted from Concord's finance committee charge. So that's, certainly we could modify if the finance committee wants some more stuff to do. We could modify that charge through the
Well,
town.
no, I'm not, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the FinCom be asked to be the capital planning committee. I'm just, particularly this last bullet, around the monitoring aspect is something, we look at every year. And that's the piece. I mean, that's a piece related to FinCom in general. Overall, again, as I said earlier, I think an enhanced process that we were headed towards without the standing committee is probably the best approach from my perspective, but that's all.
Well,
I'd like to discuss what we would gain by having the standing capital planning committee as opposed to the enhanced process. And if there are elements of the red text that should be incorporated in the enhanced process if we do not recommend a standing committee.
Well, I think it was basically these, the top two.
The citizen
Statement.
involvement, okay.
Yeah.
So
Continuity
how-
and focus on capital planning.
uh-huh.
I also feel I'm really torn between these two. I've been back and forth the whole time. And I think what the committee would do would be to put some teeth into the process. If we could get those teeth into the other enhanced process, we'd have the best of both worlds. So one of the teeth that we did put in was down in one of the lower bullets, it says annual September presentation. So if we're going to go with the enhanced process, I would like to see some very firm specifics like dates and things like templates and just, I don't want it to be loosey-goosey kind of, otherwise we need a committee. So that's what I think is missing, that we haven't figured out how to put enough specifics into the enhanced process.
So
What kind of specifics are you talking about, Terry?
well, for example, if can you go down a little bit on this slide? Just- You've got one in here. On your screen share, can you just go down a little bit?
On this, yeah.
Yeah. There it is. Annual September presentation. So I want to see some time frames. That's a specific. I think having a template and having criteria are good specifics. And I think if we can get some specifics around how the citizen participation is going to work. We talked about how citizens don't like when it's just the finance committee and the school committee and the select board are sitting around and they're sitting in the back and they have to wait for public comment. And so this recommendation, the way we have it now, is not specific enough. It doesn't have enough teeth in it yet about how we're going to provide citizen involvement, continuity, and being proactive, the things that Carl is really trying to achieve here. I think we're getting there, but we're not quite there yet.
Sure.
So I'm going to say something and I'm glad it's live because Steve and Jared and Lori may wring my neck, as may the select board. But if you want a little bit more involvement explicitly on the part of citizens, perhaps one thing to consider is a format that's used in federal rulemaking, whereby federal government puts out a proposed rule, 60 days of comments where any member of the public can send in comments. And then when the agency publishes the final rule, they end up having to summarize, not address every single comment in detail, but summarize those comments and acknowledge the comments and indicate whether they, if and how they took them into account. They don't always have to take them into account, of course, but maybe that's some format of that is something to consider if there's a sense that just speaking up at a meeting isn't enough public input. Just a thought.
Okay, thank you. All right. So this is, it seems to me that this discussion is in process. I'm happy to take a straw vote if we'd like to test our consensus on whether we want to proceed with the enhanced process versus adding a standing capital planning committee to that recommendation. And then I want to take public comment. So tell me,
Can I
are you,
throw-
yeah, Cynthia, yes.
Another wrench into your,
Yeah, why not?
and I forgot, I forgot to mention this earlier, but how can any of this be codified?
There's a state enabling Mass General Law that basically describes a capital planning committee that a town can set up.
Okay, so
We
that,
could adopt that at town meeting. And again, you're the thing about
would have,
authority, town meeting has the authority. That's the authority.
but it would have to go through town meeting a year from now.
Okay, so
Yep.
that's good to know. So Carl, would you be able to identify that Mass General Law so that we could all have a look at it? Not on the
Yeah,
spot,
it's
but
chapter 41. Wait a minute, let me see.
Carl, do you want to stop sharing,
Yeah.
stop screen share so we can
Yeah.
see each other?
Oh, can I screen share it? Okay, I can do that.
no, Stephen will,
While he's doing that, I just want to ask if we should put a placeholder article in this town meeting warrant, because we haven't decided anything yet. By the time we get to town meeting in June, we're supposed to be completely finished. And if we can always remove the article, but we can't add it. So if we're maybe going to need an article, maybe we need to put in a placeholder.
when does the warrant close?
Thursday, the 25th. Yeah, Carl, stop sharing screen so we can see each other.
Can you see that?
No, I want you to stop. I want to be able to see us.
We want to, would you be able to stop your screen share, please, Carl?
Oh, sure, yeah,
Thank you.
you can stop it.
Great.
I think that what I just heard about in the discussion about committee versus no committee bordered on a discussion about the form of government. Because when I hear Terry say that citizens aren't satisfied with just the select board, school committee, and finance committee having discussions about this, I think, yes, but those are the representatives that are chosen to have those discussions by the citizens. And to be honest with you, all you'd be doing is, I feel like adding a standing committee would add another committee to that layer. And then the citizens who aren't on that committee are still sitting in the back of the room. And that's why I felt from the very beginning, a standing committee doesn't get you what I keep. And I know, Terry, that there are citizens who want to have their voices heard. I think there are opportunities that in the enhanced process. I do think that the difference between having voices heard and having, agreement on what was said are that's outside, I think, what we can accomplish here.
Right.
The other thing is, I'd have to look at the statute and have town council run it down, because sometimes state statutes are superseded by local charters, sometimes they're not. And so I think we need some analysis, and the short of it is, I don't know that a placeholder is something that we're ready for right now, Terry. I mean, I just think if you imagine the select board, it's like to kind of cram it in now, I think would be tough when we don't really know what we're going to say, just from an administrative standpoint and something else to track. But I agree with you that if we finish in June, are we really waiting almost a year to get something promulgated if a state statute is needed? I just think all of a sudden I just heard this conversation mushroom into something much larger than capital planning, and I just wanted to say, well, what are we really trying to get at?
So it seems to me that it is premature to put a warrant article on, since we have just not really vetted that conversation at all. And I don't think that there is anything that would preclude whatever recommendations we send to the select board from being implemented in the next year. And that if a mass general law had to be tapped in order for us to codify a committee, that could certainly happen at the next town meeting. I mean, it's there's not, it doesn't seem to me that there is a time pressure on this for sequencing tier 3 projects, because the truth is we have just one big project underway. So by the time the next one will come along, we would have plenty of time to really fully consider whether we want to change that.
Mhm.
Just don't wait 20 years.
Right. So I do think that I think it would be helpful to take citizen comment. But would this task force like to have a straw vote in advance of that on whether we support adding a standing committee, or whether we support continuing to work on the precision of the enhanced process to include the aspects?
Citizen comments would be helpful to, prior to the.
Everyone in agreement? All right. Are there any comments?
Just a question. I mean, citizens are free to comment now. What do we mean by taking citizen comment?
They're free to comment. I'm talking about comment at this meeting on what they have heard today.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about the process.
No. I'm talking about this.
Yeah,
meeting.
okay.
So I see Dean Banfield has his hand up and Carlin Reed has her hand up. So Carlin, will you begin, please?
Thank you, Carlin Reed, 83 Wits End. I wish you folks had taken that straw poll, because I have my own personal estimations of who's going to vote which way. Personally, we'll see how it turns out next week. Personally, I think the enhanced process is the better route to go. And I would encourage the committee to consider that, because it allows the town and the school district to maintain the flexibility they currently have with their own various capital plans. And I'm very glad that this process has shown what those capital planning processes are. I think that's the major benefit of this whole process. So I would encourage you to lean that way if you weren't already. I understand there are some merits of a standing committee, but I don't think it's necessary at this time. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Dean?
Dean Banfield, 73 Walden Terrace, a member of the Finance Committee, but speaking for myself. The Finance Committee has been, kind of looking to the town to establish a strong methodology at a minimum. And they have sent notices saying we would prefer a committee to do this work. The report that was done, the facilities management report that was done in the 2003-4 kind of timeframe, was an excellent piece of work. It laid out a roadmap which was not fundamentally followed because there was no focus on it. Now, the idea coming out of this task force is that we recommit ourselves to having a way of always being focused. But if you have a committee and that's their job, that's their whole reason for being. I've been on 2 committees that have an annual cycle of processes, and they've been very successful. The Community Preservation Committee has a schedule. We need your applications for grants. We review the grants. We line them up. We decide on what we're going to give as grant allocations, and we move forward. The Finance Committee has a guidelines process. We review budgets. We have a preliminary guideline. We go through that exercise. We do it again, and we finalize our guideline recommendations. It's an annual cycle. And a committee which has a standing list of preferred or anticipated projects, all in different states, as Parashar was saying. Some might be, in a feasibility mode, some might be just spitballing, some might be much farther down the road in terms of knowing how much they'll cost. Having an annual review of that's done by a committee, and it's all their purpose for being, I think would be a very good benefit to the community. It also offloads a job that the select board is stretched pretty thin and isn't really in the mode of having to open up space in their busy agendas to do this work in a very significant way. So having a committee bring back recommendations on an annual basis, this is where we are, this is what we see, this is what we think will be next. I would strongly recommend a committee doing that work. That's my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else? No. Okay. So would you like to take the straw vote? Would you like to sleep on it and discuss it again on the 31st? Let's do that.
Sleep on it.
Let's reflect on our conversation today and the comments that we've received from Carlin and from Dean, and consider what we would gain by having a standing capital planning committee as opposed to what we might lose or be able to incorporate into the enhanced process without an additional committee.
Right, it was such an important vote. Can we review any correspondence or feedback we have gotten on this topic, specifically the standing committee versus the, I know I could dig it up, but I know we've gotten several formal letters, and I might, legal and voters and the finance, did the finance committee send us a letter?
Would it be helpful if we sent that around again?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. So our next meeting is the
31st, Wednesday, the 31st, in 2 weeks.
We'll get it done.
Thank you.
Homework outside of preparing for the vote and discussion about.
So thank you for your input, Cynthia, on authority, process, responsibility. Carl, thank you for your input on the standing committee. Parashar, thank you for your offer to build fabulous graphics to support the template. And Stephen, thanks for the calculator tool. That was good to see. Terry, appreciate the effort, continued efforts on the financial template. So, good. Any parting shots?
Right on time again.
That's the goal.
Just congratulations again.
Thank you very much. See you all in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. See you on the
Okay.
31st.
Right.
Bye.
Motion to adjourn?
Bye. Oh, yeah, thank
Motion
you.
to
Is there a
adjourn?
second? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone in
Wow,
favor?
from the shadows, Jared Stanton.
No, nice
Way to
save there,
go.
Jared.
I had to say something during this meeting.
Thank you, Jared.
I'm in traffic.
Keep us on track. Yeah, good. All right, everyone who supports this motion that's been seconded can go home.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.